Okay. So the endocrine system, what does it do? It releases hormones. Okay, so hormones are chemical messengers. And they're chemical messengers that have effects throughout the body. Okay, so one hormone produced in one area will have an effect somewhere else. And the areas where they have effects are called the target tissues. These effects tend to take hours, minutes, days, years. Okay, so in comparison to the nervous system, the endocrine system takes longer. Okay, it's slower, but its effects are longer lasting. So here are some things that are controlled by the endocrine system, things like metabolism, biological clock, reproductive system. A lot of things in the body are controlled by hormones. So hormones, again, have very powerful functions, even though very powerful effects, even though they're secreted in minute amounts. When you're talking about giving an animal epinephrine, it just takes a small amount of epinephrine to have an effect. So very potent. Okay, now, again, we've got a human here, but just want to show that animals, mammals have the same sorts of endocrine glands. We're going to point out and say briefly what they do in one or two words, and then we're going to go into more detail. So up in the brain we have the pineal gland. Anybody can name a hormone secreted by the pineal gland? Melatonin. Okay, melatonin is responsible for setting sleep-wake cycles, among other things. Okay. A hypothalamus, why is that important? It is the master gland, together with the pituitary. Technically your textbook calls the pituitary the master gland, but I agree with you because the hypothalamus is really the master of the master. It controls the pituitary, and the pituitary secretes some 9 hormones. And so it's a really important part of the brain, the link between the endocrine and the nervous system. Okay. The pituitary gland, again, we call the master gland, but it's really being run by the hypothalamus. Then we've got the thyroid gland. Okay, what hormone? T4, which is also known as thyroxine. Okay, thyroxine does what? It sets the metabolic rate, right? Yeah, metabolic rate. You ever had that friend that could eat like 4 times a day and they're still skinny? You what?
Hyperthyroid.
You're hyperthyroid? Okay. So you can just like, and anything? Okay. 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 How long?
7 years.
Oh, okay. Wow. That's rare in younger people. It wasn't great Graves' disease hyperthyroid, right? Just.
No, I guess it depends which doctor you ask. My
Oh.
GP was suspecting Graves'.
Oh, okay.
You know, others hasn't just said, oh yeah, hyperthyroid.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's interesting. No, I had a friend of mine that, he was a bigger, taller guy, and in grad school, he was kind of tall, but also a little bit doughy, and then he went away for a while, didn't see him for a couple of years, and came back, was all skinny. It was like, sort of the weight loss you have during puberty, but he was like 25 at the time. He's like, I don't know, I just started losing weight, and then a couple of years later, they found out that he had Graves' disease, that he was hyperthyroid, and they had to treat it. So, yeah, hyperthyroid's not that uncommon. Parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, which regulates what? Calcium, okay. Our thymus gland secretes something called thymosin, which helps to regulate the maturity of our T cells, right? It's important for the immune system. Okay, the adrenal glands, which here on our human are shown on the kidneys, and cats and dogs are detached from the kidneys, secrete things like epinephrine, we just talked about. They secrete also cortisol and aldosterone. And our pancreas, what does that do? Insulin, what else?
Oh, I still have to break down that.
So insulin, glucagon are the main ones you need to know. And then ovaries give you some hormones. Progesterone and estrogen. And testes, testosterone. Okay. So even though this is human, they're in similar places on animals. And we'll talk about what the effects of the hormones are, and then what are the steps necessary for hormone secretion. Okay, so hormones can be classified into 2 types. They're either lipid-soluble or they are water-soluble. Okay, lipid-soluble hormones, because their lipids require a protein carrier to be transported throughout the blood. Blood is primarily what? Water. It's primarily water. And we know that lipids don't dissolve well in the water. And so in order to be transported by the blood, cholesterol-based hormones, steroid hormones require a protein carrier. Okay? But because they are steroids, because they're fats, they can directly move through their target tissue membranes. And that's because the cell membranes of cells are made up of what type of molecules? Phospholipids. And remember, like dissolves like. So cholesterol is a lipid, phospholipids are a lipid, they can dissolve one in another. Okay. So examples here, the main ones we're talking about steroid hormones. Water-soluble hormones are often going to be protein-based. Because they are protein-based, they don't need a special carrier. They already dissolve freely in blood. Okay. But they're unable to go through the cell membrane, so they have to bind to the outside of the cell membrane of their target tissues, where they activate something called a second messenger. Okay, examples here, peptide hormones, protein hormones. So think about things like insulin. Okay. So insulin is a good example of a protein hormone or an amino acid-based hormone. Now, the composition of a hormone is going to affect the way in which we administer it. So this is just showing the two pathways in which hormones travel throughout the bloodstream. Looking at our steroid hormones, our lipid-soluble hormones, let's say this is the testis. It's secreting testosterone. The testosterone has to be carried, okay, by a carrier protein, and then it moves through the blood, and it goes directly through the cell of its target tissue, and then alters transcription and translation within that cell. Okay, so simple enough. Now, if we look at protein hormones or water-soluble hormones, for example, if we look at the hormones produced by the pancreas, okay, which is an amino acid hormone, travels through the blood, doesn't need a carrier, gets to its target tissue, and then binds to the outside receptors. Okay, that receptor will let loose a second molecule, usually cyclic AMP, within the cell, which then travels to the nucleus, alters or modifies transcription and translation. So a lot of what hormones do are alter what the cell is doing. Okay. Remember when we talked about muscles, and we said that muscles can be synergists or antagonists depending on whether they're cooperating or whether they're working against each other. The same thing can happen with hormones. Okay? Two hormones can have similar functions. For example, glucagon, what does that hormone do? Increases blood sugar. But so do cortisol, and so does growth hormone. So all these hormones can be considered synergists. On the other hand, if we look at something like glucagon and insulin, they work against each other, in which case they'll be called what? Antagonists, right? Okay, so let's start out. Get yourself out a piece of paper, and we're going to draw how the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland and many of the other endocrine glands in the body. Okay. Where in the brain is the hypothalamus located? The hypo meaning below, so it's below the thalamus. And if I'm going to draw, spinal cord, something like that, it's sort of like right in here. I'm just drawing a very general region. And I'm going to make it a little bit larger. Okay. If this is your pituitary gland, which, let's face it, looks like a scrotum hanging below the brain. Okay. And I can get rid of my brain stem because I need some room here. So the hypothalamus is a nondescript area in the brain that is the link between the endocrine system and the nervous system. Now the interesting thing is that it does receive input, okay, from the cortex, which is the seeing, sensing, processing area of the brain, the consciously aware in people and probably in animals as well. And so it is possible for visual input, auditory input, to have an effect on your secretion of hormones. Connected to the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland, which secretes 9 hormones. Okay? And the hypothalamus, remember, is in charge of the pituitary gland. Another name for the pituitary gland is called the hypophysis or hypophysis. And so we have the neural hypophysis, which is the posterior pituitary, and the adenohypophysis. I'm not going to use that terminology, but if you ever see hypophysis and wonder what they're talking about, they're talking about the pituitary gland. Okay, so again, here's our hypothalamus on an actual brain. Okay, this is the thalamus, hypothalamus is just below it. Okay, here's our pituitary gland. When you get a chance to look at the brains this week in lab, if you haven't already, the dissected brains will be missing their pituitary because when they pull the brains out of the skull, the pituitary gets left behind in the sphenoid bone. It's actually surrounded by sphenoid bone, so unless you're very careful, it gets ripped off. Okay, so the pituitary gland has two lobes, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Now we call the pituitary the master gland because it secretes 9 different hormones. Okay. Now notice I didn't say makes. Okay. It doesn't make 9 hormones. It makes probably 7 hormones, but it does secrete 9 hormones. Okay. The two lobes here, anterior pituitary, which is usually the one that's a little bit lower, and the posterior pituitary. Okay. And so within there we have special neurosecretory cells. These are cells that both conduct nerve impulses, but they also secrete hormones. And so let's look at the hormones produced by the anterior pituitary. Okay. They all have abbreviations. There's 7 of them in all: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, etc. So, and I have arrows coming out here: growth hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH. Where do you think that one's going? What do you think the target tissue is for thyroid stimulating hormone? Thyroid, okay. So I'm going to draw a thyroid gland. So have that in there. What about prolactin? Where is that going? What does pro mean? Pro? Pro means 4, lactin means milk, so it literally means go milk. Okay. So it's going to be going to the mammary glands. I'm not going to draw those. Okay. There's 2 M's in there. And then, let's see, we've got our gonadotropins, which are FSH and LH. Where are they going? Gonads. Okay, I'll just draw gonads. Okay. Now we call them gonadotropins. The interesting thing is they're going to the gonads, but tropin here represents a hormone that has an effect on another endocrine gland. So the gonads themselves, the ovaries and the testes, they are also endocrine glands. So if I ever talk about tropic hormones, we're talking about hormones that have effects on other endocrine glands. And then we have things like the adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. Okay, where is that going? Adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, which are near the kidneys, I'll put them just sort of on top of the kidneys. So all of these have different target tissues in the body. Now the important point is that who's controlling the anterior pituitary? The hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus is really in charge. And the way that it controls the anterior pituitary is by secretion of something called releasing hormones, RHs. And so we have a different releasing hormone for each one of these pituitary hormones. For example, for growth hormone, we have something called GHRH, growth hormone releasing hormone. For prolactin, we have prolactin releasing hormone. And the reason why we have these different hormones is look at the organization of the anterior pituitary. So here are neuroendocrine cells, and you can see that they are restricted to the hypothalamus. They don't extend in the pituitary. Instead, the hypothalamus and the pituitary are connected by something called a portal. Now, a portal is just a place where we have 2 capillary beds connected by a portal vein. Okay. And so these cells in the hypothalamus are producing these red dots, which are our releasing hormones, say growth hormone releasing hormone. So go ahead and label that. And then the growth hormone releasing hormone is picked up on the bloodstream, and it travels to the capillary bed in the anterior pituitary. And there, it stimulates the release of our growth hormone from the anterior pituitary. That would be the little blue dots. So big picture here is that anterior pituitary hormones are made in the anterior pituitary, but their release is caused by the production of releasing hormones, which are made in the hypothalamus and then travel to the anterior pituitary. Okay. The posterior pituitary does not make any hormones. If I ask you on an exam, which hormones are made by the posterior pituitary, the answer is none. Okay. There are, however, two hormones that are stored and secreted from the posterior pituitary, and these are ADH and oxytocin. Okay. These hormones are actually made in the hypothalamus. Okay. ADH stands for antidiuretic hormone. What is a diuretic? Makes you pee. So an antidiuretic would? Makes you not pee. Okay. So it helps to maintain water balance in the body. Oxytocin is responsible for smooth muscle contraction during the parturition process and also during the milk letdown reflex. So these are made in the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, and they're secreted when we stimulate those cells to secrete them through nervous stimulation. So here we show the connection between the posterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. What's different? What's different about our cells, the neuroendocrine cells? They're longer. Their processes extend way down in there. So there's no releasing hormones. The hormones, the blue dots, are actually made here. So imagine this is oxytocin, and it just travels down the axon and then is released from the posterior pituitary into the blood. The stimulus for release are nerve impulses. Nerve impulses traveling down from the hypothalamus to the posterior pituitary. Okay. So this is what you should have on the paper by now, something like this showing the axis between the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary. So it's already getting a little bit complicated, and we're not even about halfway through the process because we haven't talked about the target tissues for all these different hormones. So let's look at growth hormone. That was a hormone that was produced by the anterior pituitary, okay? And remember, the stimulus here would be a releasing hormone, growth hormone, releasing hormone. And so it acts on the liver, among other things, to stimulate something called IGF, which is insulin-like growth factor. And these have effects on different tissues throughout the body. We can talk about fat, muscle, and on the liver again itself. And it stimulates cellular growth. It stimulates amino acid uptake. And it also stimulates lipolysis. Okay? So these are hormones that are important for maintaining bodily growth. Okay? They're really important in fast-growing organisms. And they help also to ensure lipolysis, but they also have a role in blood sugar homeostasis. They help to raise the blood sugar. Now let's go look at thyroid-stimulating hormone. We already showed that that comes from the anterior pituitary, stimulates the thyroid to secrete thyroxine, which we'll talk about its effects, mainly metabolism, helps to speed up the metabolism. Okay. And remember, because it's an anterior pituitary hormone, it also has a releasing hormone. In this case, it's often called thyroid releasing hormone, or TRH. Now let's look at our gonadotropins. This is FSH and LH. Okay. Together they act on the gonads. Okay. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. What is a follicle? So it's a sac of epithelial tissue that nurtures or secretes something. In this case, it's the little minute sac of epithelial tissue surrounding an egg or an oocyte. And under the direction of FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, the follicle gets larger and closer towards ovulation. Okay? And it fills with fluid. And so FSH causes the follicles to grow. FSH is also important in males in that it stimulates sperm production. Now, if we look at LH, that's another gonadotropin. LH is important in females for actually ovulation. Okay? The rupture of that oocyte out of the sac and then into the fallopian tube is ovulation. Ovulation. Okay. So that's one of the functions of LH. In guys, LH stimulates testosterone production. Okay. So it's necessary for the production of testosterone. And then prolactin is one we should already know. Prolactin, produced by the anterior pituitary, stimulates the production of milk, okay, in the mammary cells. And this is a weird one where even though we have a releasing hormone, PRH, there's another hormone that's an inhibiting hormone that's actually more important in its regulation. And so normally if we have a new calf being born and it's going up to suckle on its mother's teat, what keeps that milk, what keeps that cow in lactation is actually the stimulation or suckling reflex of that new calf on its mother's teats every morning. Now if we have a dairy farm, we're going to take that calf away from the mother pretty quickly, right? Because she's producing a lot of milk. And so how do we keep that mother in lactation? Milk her every morning. Every morning we're milking that cow. Okay. We don't milk them by hand anymore, but they're still getting the stimulation of the tissue in the mammary glands that's keeping them lactation. Okay, antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Now this one is produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary. Out this way. And the primary target tissue is going to be the kidneys. And it helps us to conserve water. Think about that at any one time in most mammals, 25% of their blood volume or cardiac output is going towards the kidneys. What is the function of the kidneys? To filter the blood, remove the waste products. So initially, everything that's filtrate is destined to become urine unless we reabsorb it. So ADH is being secreted pretty much all the time, but especially in times of dehydration, and it's there to help us prevent further water loss. Okay? And so it does a couple things. It prevents water loss by the kidneys, and so the urine produced tend to be very concentrated. Imagine if you've been outside all day running around, haven't had as much to drink as you should, what does your urine look like?
Yellow.
Really dark yellow, okay? And we see this in animals as well, because ADH is helping to reclaim that water and put it back in the blood. The other thing that ADH does is reduce the amount of sweat produced, okay, which is a source of water loss. And then if you think about an animal that has not had water, let's say for a couple days, what does that do to blood volume if we don't have as much water?
More concentrated.
Yeah, blood's more concentrated, but the volume of blood is what? Lower, because we've lost some water, and water is a large part of blood. So think about blood pressure. What is having a lower blood volume going to do to blood pressure? You think about it, you've got these tubes, and you've got a gallon of fluid flowing through them, and now you only have 3/4 of a gallon. What does that do to pressure? It's going to lower it. So normally, under dehydration, blood pressure might go down, but we don't want it to go down. So one of the effects, the compensatory effects of ADH is constriction of arterioles. And that's important because another name for this hormone is called vasopressin. Vaso meaning vessel and pressin to constrict. So ADH is pretty much being produced all the time unless you're ultra hydrated. But I can give you an idea of its effects is that ADH is inhibited if you drink alcohol. So you drink alcohol, imagine going out on a Friday night, you have a drink of alcohol and a couple, and you might urinate once in the bathroom, and then 30 minutes later you're back again, and you're back again. You just feel like all you're doing that whole night is peeing, right? Okay, and what does that urine look like? It's translucent, right? Okay, it's very dilute urine, and that's because we've basically prevented our brain from being able to secrete ADH, and so a lot of the fluid is being lost through the urinary system, and that's why you feel so crappy the next morning. You're dehydrated and stuff like that. Okay, so ADH is regulated by the hypothalamus. Hypothalamus controls the posterior pituitary by nerve impulses. So the hypothalamus is monitoring the osmolality of the blood. Osmolality is just the saltiness. As we lose water, what happens to the blood saltiness? Does it go up or down? More salty or less salty? More salty, okay. So the hypothalamus is able to sense this more saltiness and stimulates the posterior pituitary to secrete our ADH, which again causes more reabsorption of water, less loss in the kidneys, constriction of blood vessels to maintain pressure, and also reduction in sweating. Oxytocin, again, produced by the hypothalamus, stored in the posterior pituitary, The effects here are during pregnancy. It helps to stimulate uterine contractions, but also it helps to stimulate the milk letdown reflex. We are finding that oxytocin may actually have a role in males as well with pair bonding. We found out that if you look at a mammal and have two mice in a container and they have a litter of little mice, they can be very nurturing to that. If you deny them oxytocin, they may just eat all the baby mice, which is not a good situation. So oxytocin, at least in males, is sort of the love hormone that increases bonding between mates and also with offspring. Okay, thyroxine. Thyroxine, remember, was the hormone produced by our thyroid gland, and it had effects all over the body, stimulates increased metabolism, sometimes increased body temperature. The other thing it did was secrete calcitonin, which helped to increase the rate of bone deposition. Okay. I do want you to know the control of thyroid hormone. So imagine I say, on an exam, what are the steps necessary to make thyroid hormone? So who starts the whole process? If you don't know the answer is what? Hypothalamus. Okay. So you're right. In fact, the message to produce thyroxine starts in the hypothalamus through production of thyroid-releasing hormone, goes to the anterior pituitary, which secretes thyroid-stimulating hormone, travels to the thyroid, which secretes thyroxine. Now, as the levels of thyroxine rise, it's should have a negative feedback either on the hypothalamus or on the pituitary itself. Okay. Why do we want to have a negative feedback for most of these hormones? Yeah, we want to maintain a set point. If we have positive feedback, it's just going to keep pushing us away, which would be bad. You don't want your metabolism to go up a little bit and then go up more and then go up more and then go up more. That would usually not be a very healthy state. So most of these hormones are regulated through a negative feedback loop. So we produce our TRH, produce TSH, causes the thyroid to produce thyroxine, and that feeds back on the hypothalamus, causing a reduction in TRH and a reduction in TSH. So negative feedback. Okay, same with calcitonin and also parathyroid hormone. Clasts break down bone. And what happens to the blood calcium when we break down bone? It goes up. So PTH secretion stimulates osteoclasts, causes increase in blood calcium levels, okay, which is important. Okay. We need a certain amount of calcium in our bloodstream. On the other hand, calcitonin causes a reduction in blood calcium levels because it causes the osteoblasts to deposit the calcium into the bone. Okay, so the gonads, we've talked about them briefly. Testosterone was the primary hormone produced by the testis. So here are the gonads. What was the stimulus to get this whole thing started? How do we talk to the gonads from the hypothalamus? What was the message?
Is it the gonadotropin?
Gonadotropin, but in this case, it's going to be gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, okay, travels the anterior pituitary, tells us to secrete our gonadotropins, FSH and LH, which goes to our gonads. And if these are testes, LH is going to cause us to secrete testosterone. Where are the target tissues for testosterone? Well, that's where it's made, is the testes. We already said the target tissues are muscle tissue, the brain to some extent. You think about all secondary sex characteristics. In animals, we don't necessarily have like a big growth of body hair, but we do have different behaviors, right? Okay, marking behaviors that we see in cats and things like that. Okay, now as testosterone levels increase, they're going to have a negative feedback onto the brain and cause the reduction in gonadotropin releasing hormone and also in our gonadotropins, FSH and LH. Ovaries produce estrogen and progesterone. Okay. Again, the stimulus here is going to be our FSH and LH. Estrogens are necessary for development of the follicles, for maturation of the uterus, whereas progesterone's in there. What does that word mean, pro? For. Gestin, what are we referring to? Gestation. Help to maintain gestation. Principally, we're talking about mammals that have a placental connection between the uterus and the embryo or fetus. So progesterone helps to maintain the uterine lining during the gestation period. And here's a female reproductive tract. Would probably be a cat. Oh, this is a dog. And so you can see that they have a vagina and a cervix similar to people, but instead of having a single uterus, they actually have two horns to the uterus here. And if you look in a sow or if you look in a cat, you can have embryos in both horns of the uterus. Okay. So other endocrine glands, we've already talked about some, the pineal body that makes melatonin, the thymus, and then the kidney. Remember, the kidney makes erythropoietin, which was important for the production of what? Red blood cells. Okay. All right, now let's go look at the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands in humans are located on top of the kidneys, but in cats and dogs they're detached, but they're still in the same general area. There's two different regions of the adrenal glands that are important. We have the medulla and the cortex. The cortex is the outside, the medulla is the center part. Okay, if we take a look at the outside, the cortex, there's different zones in here. You don't need to know the names of these zones, but what you do need to know is that these are different types of hormones that are produced by the adrenal cortex. Things like mineralocorticoids, like aldosterone. Okay? These help to maintain ion-water balance. Glucocorticoids, like cortisol, our stress hormone. And then androgens. Okay? They help with libido, among other things. And then when we get into the medulla itself, and the deep inside there, we have production of our epinephrine, norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. So let's take a look at some of these areas. Mineralocorticoids, the big thing that I want you to know is aldosterone. Aldosterone helps the body to reabsorb sodium and chloride, which are important electrolytes. An electrolyte is just another name for what? Salt. That's all it is. Helps us to reabsorb sodium and chloride. These are solutes. And if we reabsorb a solute, what wants to follow it?
Water.
Right, water, because solutes suck. And so by reabsorbing sodium and chloride, we can help to retain water as well. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this one when we hit the urinary system. Okay, next one is DHEA, just adrenal androgens. It's responsible for libido, among other things. And really important is cortisol. Cortisol is one of our corticosteroids, and it is an important stress hormone. Okay. Cortisol does a few different things. One is it helps to free up energy. So think about times of stress or emergency. One thing we want to make sure is the body has adequate energy reserves. And so it stimulates the breakdown of proteins and also of fats so we can free up calories to fuel body functions. It also has an inhibitory function on the immune system. So when we have high levels of cortisol, things like inflammation tend to be inhibited. Immune reactions tend to be inhibited. This can have good effects and bad effects. Why would we ever want to inhibit or dampen immune response? Allergies, if we have, an allergic response where you have a pet, for example, my dog responds to grass. He's allergic to grass. And that's all that's out there, right? He has a response. And so he itchy and inflammation and stuff like that. He licks himself till his paw pads fall off. One of the drugs we can treat him with is prednisone. Prednisone is a corticosteroid. It inhibits the immune system, it dampens the immune system, so he doesn't have that reaction. Feedback. So then it's okay. If we look at the feedback loop, it starts with the production of corticotropic releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, goes to the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary secretes adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH, and that causes the cortex to secrete cortisol, which has a negative impact, or negative feedback on the pituitary and hypothalamus, because we don't want too much cortisol in the body. Okay? Too much cortisol would be bad. Now let's take a look at the medulla. The medulla here secretes are epinephrine and norepinephrine, otherwise known as adrenaline. And really we think that the adrenal medulla is like this displaced ganglion, similar to the ganglion that we had outside the spinal cord, or autonomic ganglion, and that there are nerve cells there, and it's basically like an area where nerve cells would synapse with one another, but instead it produces massive amounts of adrenaline in the case of an emergency. So remember, adrenaline initiates our fight or flight response. And we already said that the effects that adrenaline are going to have are increased heart rate, pupil dilation. So all of these are effects of epinephrine release. And they tend to be released very, very quickly because the adrenal medulla is controlled by nerve impulses, not by releasing hormones. And then we get to the pancreas. Pancreas is weird because everything we've talked about so far was sort of directly or indirectly controlled by the pituitary or the hypothalamus. The pancreas, not so much. Like probably 90% of the cells in the pancreas are actually just cells that produce digestive enzymes. But every so often, if you look at a slide of pancreas, you'll see these little isolated islets of Langerhans. And these are clusters of endocrine cells. We have alpha cells, beta cells, and I think F cells in there as well. The point is that I want you to know that the alpha cells here secrete glucagon and the beta cells secrete insulin. Okay. So glucagon and insulin are antagonistic hormones. Let's take a look at the effects of these hormones. Imagine that you have an animal, let's say it's a pig, and they haven't eaten for a few hours. They're going to have a resting blood sugar rate. And a lot of mammals, it's somewhere around 90 milligrams per deciliter. And if we feed that pig some slop, okay, what's going to happen to its blood glucose? It's going to go up. So blood glucose levels become elevated after a meal. And at some point, the production of insulin is going to increase. And insulin helps to take glucose out of the blood and then put it together to make polysaccharides within the liver and also within muscles. So insulin pulls glucose out of the blood, puts it in muscle, puts it in liver, okay, brings glucose levels back down. Now you imagine you have the same animal, let's say it's a dog instead of a pig, and you're like, you left home today and you forgot to feed your dog. First of all, you're a horrible person, okay? But what's going to happen to that blood glucose levels over time if we forgot to feed that dog? What's the tendency? They maybe go down. Okay? The tendency might be for a drop in blood glucose with prolonged fasting, okay? Because the brain, the nervous system is using that glucose up. Now, ideally what would happen here is that we'll have an increased production of glucagon. Glucagon helps the animal deal with low blood glucose levels by stimulating the production of glucose from glycogen in the liver and the muscles. We call this glycogenolysis. Okay? And in doing that, we produce more blood glucogen, more blood glucose, and when the glucose levels go up, glucagon turns off again. What kind of feedback system is this? Negative feedback. And it's negative because it always tries to bring us back down to set point. Okay? That's the goal of negative feedback. Now sometimes we have disorders and the endocrine system may not work right. So we'll talk briefly about some endocrine disorders. And they happen for one of three reasons. One is we have too much of a hormone, hypersecretion. We have too little of a hormone, hyposecretion, or we're insensitive to a hormone. So as a third answer down there, write hormone insensitivity. Because sometimes we have the right number of hormone molecules, the right number of receptors, but those receptors are just no longer as receptive as they used to be. And we'll look at an example. The first one having to do with the pancreas is diabetes mellitus, or mellitus if you're British. Okay. We see this in people as well as in mammals, other mammals. Okay. So the symptoms here for diabetes mellitus are polyuria, polydipsia. And what does that mean? Excessive urination, excessive thirst. Okay, and it happens because blood glucose levels are so high that some of that glucose is washed away in the urine and it causes the kidneys to be really inefficient. So you have a dog or a cat that's peeing a lot, When I think, okay, is that diabetes mellitus? The way that we can test this is by testing blood glucose levels. We're also looking for something called glycosuria. Glyco meaning sugar, urea meaning what? Urine. The reason it's called diabetes mellitus as opposed to diabetes insipidus is because the way that we used to diagnose this a long time ago, before we had these little test kits, is that a human physician would drink a little bit of the urine from its patient, and if it was sweet, if it tasted like honey, which is what mellitus means, it indicated they had this particular form of diabetes. Okay, so we don't do that now. We have test strips, fine, and we can test the animal, figure out whether it's diabetic. Now sometimes, just like in people, we can have an animal that just doesn't produce enough insulin. But what is more common really is to have sort of a delayed onset diabetes where we have enough insulin maybe, but the body's just not being as receptive to it. So we might have to administer insulin, in which case how are we going to administer that insulin? Injections, right? Because it's an amino acid hormone. The other thing is that lifestyle changes can sometimes reduce the severity of diabetes mellitus. So obesity and diabetes go hand in hand. Okay, then we have hypothyroidism. Okay, hypothyroidism, we're talking about reduced secretion of what hormone? Thyroxine. Thyroxine sets our metabolic rate. Okay, so here we can have we look at some changes in the fur. We also have obesity, lethargy. Animals become very unable to regulate their own body temperature. They have these heat-seeking behaviors. And so the way that we can diagnose this is by doing a hormone titer. And if it's deficient, if it's low, we can give you some supplementation in the form of levothyroxine. So in general, it's easier to treat hyposecretion of a hormone than it is hypersecretion. So the opposite of hypothyroidism is hyperthyroidism, greater than normal secretion of thyroxine. And that's what we were just talking about a minute ago, right? If you have more thyroxine than normal, what would some of the effects be? Tremors. Okay. Weight loss, right? Higher metabolic rate. Now, in animals, we tend to see this more in older cats. Okay. The other thing it causes is a pounding rapid heartbeat, okay, tachycardia. Okay. Normally a resting heart rate in a human, 60 to 80, and then all of a sudden, if it's up in the hundreds all the time, it makes us think about it. Same with older cats. They shouldn't have a heart rate that's that high, but if you had a cat that has this increased heart rate, increased activity levels, somebody in the last class was talking, their cat just became more irritable, had a lot of hair loss, and so they tested it, and sure enough, it had a hypersecretion of thyroxine. This is a little bit harder to treat. So there are medications that we can use to treat it. We can also do surgical removal of the thyroid gland, ablation, more in people than we do in cats and dogs. Or sometimes they actually use radioactive little inserts in the thyroid to reduce the amount of thyroxine being produced. Let's look at hyperadrenocorticism. Okay. Hyperadrenocorticism, so we're talking about Cushing's disease. Cushing's disease happens because we have too much corticosteroids. We have too much cortisol in the system. And so a lot of times you can see this, we get these like pot-bellied dogs, okay, and they can also have reduced fur, alopecia, things like this. Two different causes here. Okay. One could be because we have some sort of tumor, a pituitary mass on the pituitary gland that is cranking out ACTH all the time. Another reason, which is uncommon, is that we have an iatrogenic cause. Okay, that we are inducing this in an animal because we're overprescribing corticosteroids. So prednisone, we talked about earlier, is a great anti-inflammatory drug. We use it for a variety of reasons in the human field and also the veterinary field. It's a cheap drug. It works wonders, but you've got to be careful with it because if you use it for too long, you can depress the immune system and then cause these symptoms like this, fat deposition down here and pot-bellied appearance. And it also causes, an increase in the amount of wear and tear in the joints and things like that. So you want to be careful with overusing corticosteroids. Okay, the way that we treat Cushing's disease depends on what the cause is. If it's simply that we're giving too much corticosteroids in a treatment of another disease, well, we just stop that. Okay? We reduce the corticosteroid intake gradually. On the other hand, if it's a pituitary mass, there are ways to give drugs that will reduce the production of cortisol from the adrenal glands. So here you can see a dog with the pot-bellied appearance, a lot of alopecia or hair loss there. Again, it's not uncommon to have this caused by giving too much prednisone. Okay? And then we have something called Addison's disease. Addison's disease is hypoadrenocorticism. Okay? We have lower than normal amounts of cortisol. We have some of the different symptoms there for Addison's disease. It's not that common. Of all these different diseases, you're probably most likely to see the hyperthyroid in cats, and also likely to see the overproduction of cortisol or Cushing's disease in dogs. Okay, are there any questions?